Welcome to the history section.
We're starting today at what you could call the absolute peak of Frankish power under Charlemagne. But there's a fundamental paradox of Germanic tradition.
Okay, that illusion of permanence, let's unpack that. By 813, just before his death, Charlemagne's empire was a phenomenon. Talking about the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople
Right, the other Rome.
and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad.
And that's critical. Getting recognition from Baghdad, which was arguably the intellectual and economic center of the world then, that was not a small thing.
It signaled he wasn't just some local strongman.
Not at all. He was a player on the world stage, a figure who demanded diplomatic attention. But, while it looked so grand on the outside, the borders themselves were constantly being tested.
So let's trace those borders. To the north, you have Charlemagne himself campaigning deep into Scandinavia.
Uh-huh. He was fighting various tribal kingdoms. The sources mention the Suetidi, who are the Swedes, the the Danes, of course.
And even peoples in what's now Norway, the Hordaland and Rogaland peoples.
These were not minor skirmishes. They were costly campaigns, and they show the incredible reach of the Frankish military. It was about securing a very volatile northern frontier.
And then the southern frontier was just as demanding.
Oh, absolutely. The empire stretched all the way down to the Spanish marches.
And we should clarify, this wasn't a line on a map. A march is a borderland, a buffer zone.
Exactly. It was a mountainous, contested zone carved out between the Frankish kingdom and the incredibly sophisticated and powerful Muslim emirate of Cordoba.
Holding that march would have required a constant military presence.
Constant. And a lot of diplomatic maneuvering to keep Islamic influence from spreading north of the Pyrenees.
And then moving east, he controlled northern Italy.
He'd conquered the old Lombard kingdom, and this gave him a new, crucial role, protector of the Papal States.
Which in practice meant he was the master of the local dukes in places like Spoleto and Benevento.
It did. So by 813, there's no question. He is the undisputed military and political authority of Western Christendom.
So you have this image of a unified, divinely sanctioned empire. But you said the foundation was designed to fail.
Because the Frankish tradition of succession pretty much guaranteed it would break up. And this brings us to the will that Charlemagne drew up in 806.
The 806 will, it's fascinating because it shows how he was thinking. He was thinking like a Frank, not a Roman.
That's the perfect way to put it. The Roman imperial model, the ideal, it demanded unitary succession. You pass the whole thing on intact.
Preserve the state above all.
Precisely. But Charlemagne was a Frankish king first and an emperor second. And Frankish tradition required a king to divide his kingdom among all his legitimate living sons.
So the will did just that.
Meticulously. It split his vast domain into 3 independent portions for his 3 heirs, each with its own geographic and political sphere.
And the only thing tying them together, the only requirement in the will,
Was the defense of the Church of St. Peter.
that's it.
That's it. It's such a critical detail. It proves that his title, Emperor of the Romans, it didn't come with the political obligation to keep the empire whole.
So the title was more of a religious duty.
I think so. A duty to defend the Pope, to help establish God's kingdom on earth. But it didn't override the fundamental political mechanics of, partible inheritance. The unity of the empire was just. It was circumstantial. It rested on his singular, powerful personality, not in any kind of legal framework.
But this incredibly detailed plan, based on centuries of tradition,
Yeah.
just falls apart.
It fails spectacularly, and not because of a rebellion or politics, but because of a sudden biological crisis between 810 and 813.
2 of his sons die.
2 swift, completely unforeseen deaths. They just invalidate the whole plan. Pippin, his son, who's king in Italy, he dies in 810.
And then Charles the Younger, the heir apparent, dies just a year later in 811.
And just like that, the entire complex structure collapses. There's only one surviving legitimate son left.
Louis, later known as Louis the Pious, he was 35, and at the time was really just a sub-king ruling Aquitaine.
He was supposed to get a third. Now, by default, he's the sole heir to everything.
So Charlemagne has to pivot fast.
He does. In 813, he gathers the court nobles at Aachen, and he crowns Louis as joint king and co-emperor.
Now, was including the nobles a meaningful choice? Did they have a say?
Not really. The research is pretty clear on this. The nobles had no actual voice in the decision. Charlemagne's choice was absolute. But
But he had to honor the tradition.
he had to. It was about honoring the old Germanic tradition of publicly acclaiming a new king. It was a necessary ritual for legitimacy, even if the outcome was already decided by fate.
And then Charlemagne dies the next year. His chronicler, Nithard, tries to sum up his legacy.
And his words give us this incredible insight into how they thought about good governance. Nithard says Charlemagne will be admired, above all, for the tempered severity with which he subdued the fierce and iron hearts of Franks and barbarians.
Tempered severity. That's a powerful phrase.
It is, and Nithard directly contrasts it with Roman history. He says, even the might of the Roman legions had failed to truly tame these Germanic peoples.
But under Charlemagne.
Nithard claims they dared do nothing, except what was in harmony with the public welfare. So his great success wasn't just conquest, it was imposing civilization, imposing order on people who had always resisted central control.
So in 814, Louis the Pious inherits this monumental, but as you said, structurally fragile kingdom.
He does, and this unexpected turn of events, inheriting the whole thing, it forces him to completely rethink what it means to be an emperor. It kicks off about 15 years of unintended centralization.
And he gets the name the Pious for a reason.
Right. He was deeply committed to religious morality, to good order. His father was a pragmatic warlord. Louis was a reformer. He genuinely wanted the empire to be a single, unified, pious Christian state.
And he starts to conceptualize it differently. Not as a collection of kingdoms held together by his father's sword,
but as a single, unified imperial realm. A true imperium.
And you can see this shift in the language he uses right in his official title.
Oh, it's a dramatic shift. Charlemagne used that very elaborate, very specific formula. Charles, Serene Augustus governing the Roman Empire, at the same time king of the Franks and of the Lombards.
He's listing the parts,
Yeah.
acknowledging their separate identities.
Exactly. But within a year of taking the throne, Louis simplifies it. He drops the Frankish and Lombard parts and just calls himself Emperor Augustus.
That's a huge change.
It's a massive political statement. He's saying these different realms are merging conceptually and politically into one thing. The title is no longer just describing his power, it's prescribing loyalty to a central authority.
But this new philosophy, this drive for unity, it immediately crashes into that same old Frankish tradition of division.
He's trapped. He knows he has to name his own sons as heirs, but at the same time, he tries to actively reduce their independence. He uses his new unified imperial title to justify tightening his control over everything.
So his sons are crowned kings.
But they're given, you could say, chains disguised as crowns. The eldest, Lothair, he gets Italy and is made co-emperor, but he's still under his father's direct authority.
And the other two.
The second son, Louis, is coronated in Bavaria, that complex Germanic territory, and he becomes known to history as Louis the German. And the youngest, Pippin, is made king of Aquitaine.
So here's the core conflict then. It's the gap between expectation and reality.
That's it, exactly. The sons grew up hearing stories of their own father, Louis, ruling Aquitaine as a more or less independent sub-king under Charlemagne.
So they expected that same level of autonomy. They saw their kingdoms as their birthright.
But Louis the Pious, with his new definition of emperor, saw them as governors. High-level administrators maybe, but not independent monarchs. He subjected them to heavy oversight.
And this tension, this feeling of being kings but being treated like officials.
It just creates this unstable, pressurized system. Louis's religious motivation to create a unified Christian state was in direct contradiction with the political reality of partible inheritance. It was, only a matter of time before it all exploded.
An explosion finally comes in 829, and the cause is, well, it's painfully personal.
It is. It boils down to Louis the Pious's favoritism toward his youngest son, Charles.
Charles was from a second marriage, born in 823.
Right, to his wife Judith. And Louis clearly doted on this child. In 829, he decides that 6-year-old Charles needs his own kingdom.
And he carves it out of where?
He chooses Alemannia, an old Germanic territory. But Alemannia wasn't just empty land. He carved it directly out of the territory that was supposed to go to his eldest son, Lothair.
Lothair must have been furious.
He saw it for what it was, a hostile takeover, a direct reduction of his inheritance and his prestige.
So what does he do?
His reaction is politically brilliant. He doesn't just sit and stew. He immediately goes to his brothers, Pippin of Aquitaine and Louis the German.
And he warns them.
He warns them that this sets a dangerous precedent. He says, your kingdoms will be next. Our father will impoverish all of us just to benefit this new half-brother.
And the argument works.
By 830, it's worked. The 3 elder brothers declare war on their own father, the emperor.
So for the next 3 years, it's open civil war.
It is, and it culminates in 833 with a coup. The brothers get the upper hand, and they manage to trap both Louis the Pious and the young Charles. Lothair, as the eldest, claims the imperial throne.
And the Chronicle of Nithard gives us a A pretty chilling account of what happens next.
He does. He says Lothair held his father and brother in free custody, but his treatment of Charles, who's still just a boy, is really revealing.
What does he do?
He appoints monks to be Charles's companions and actively urges the child to take up monastic life.
Which is a political move.
It's a classic political move. If Charles takes vows and becomes a monk, he's permanently out of the line of succession. Game over.
But the boy doesn't take the hint.
Wisely, no. And even though Louis the Pious is deposed and a prisoner, he proves to be an incredibly shrewd political operator.
He still has the prestige of being the emperor.
He does, and he uses that plus a massive promise of more land to split his son's alliance.
He makes a deal with the other two brothers.
A very pragmatic one. He goes to Pippin and Louis the German and says, "Join me against Lothair, and I won't just restore your kingdoms, I'll enlarge them."
And the promise of more territory is enough to sway them.
The research suggests they were very eager to comply. Louis the Pious then makes this dramatic, unexpected appearance at a public assembly. It forces Lothair's hand. He's suddenly standing alone against his father and both of his brothers.
He has no choice.
He's forced to retreat back to Italy and swear an oath that he'll be content with just his own kingdom. The centralized empire is restored for a moment, but the bitterness is now permanent.
Relations stay cool, and Louis is still determined to provide for Charles.
Which keeps the instability simmering. Then, in 838, Pippin of Aquitaine dies.
And Louis sees his chance.
He immediately declares that Aquitaine will now go to Charles. Remember, Charles's last kingdom in Alemannia lasted less than a year.
Then how does that go over in Aquitaine?
It backfires spectacularly. It's really the moment the central authority finally cracks. The people of Aquitaine rebel. They completely ignore the emperor's decree.
And they crown their own king.
They crown Pippin II, who is Pippin's own son. So Louis the Pious wins back his throne, but he immediately loses control over an entire massive chunk of his empire to a local resistance movement.
So he tries again to find something for Charles, who is really earning his later nickname, Charles the Bald, or sometimes Charles the Landless.
Right. Louis gives him a piece of his own central domain, Neustria. And when Louis the Pious finally dies in 840, Charles inherits that throne. But his older half-brothers, Lothair and Louis the German, they bitterly resent this upstart having power over the Frankish heartland.
So the war starts again, almost immediately.
It does, and it's largely driven by Lothair's ego. The Annals of St. Bertrand say he was still puffed up by the imperial title and attacked both his brothers.
But this time it leads to something truly catastrophic.
The Battle of Fontenoy in 841.
The scale of the carnage there is hard to comprehend.
An estimated 40,000 Franks killed, fighting other Franks. This wasn't a border skirmish. This was the slaughter of the Frankish military elite, the very men needed to defend the empire.
The shock across the Frankish world must have been immense.
We have an eyewitness account from a man named Engelbert who wrote about it in verse. He said the fields were left white with the shrouds of the dead, comparing them to scattered birds in autumn.
And he said the day was not worthy of praise, not fit to be sung.
Exactly. This wasn't a glorious victory. It was a moral and military catastrophe. This kind of fratricide, it's the definition of a complete political breakdown.
And this internal destruction is happening just as external threats are ramping up.
That's the crucial context. While the brothers are killing each other, destroying crops, and destabilizing the entire region, pirate fleets from Scandinavia and Muslim raiders from Al-Andalus are hitting the coasts. They burn Rouen.
The chronicler Regino of Prum summed it up.
He did. He said the Frankish kings, who had just been the conquerors of the world, had lost so many men they could barely defend their own frontiers. Fontenoy created a military vacuum,
Which finally brings the brothers to the negotiating table.
to the Treaty of Verdun in 843. This is the treaty that makes the division of Charlemagne's empire permanent.
And it basically follows the lines of that old 806 will, but it's driven by exhaustion now, not by a plan.
Right. And what emerges are the three entities that will, more or less, define European history for the next 1,000 years. First, you have Charles the Bald. He gets Western France and Neustria and the old Western Frankish kingdom.
Which will eventually become France.
Essentially, yes. Second, Louis the German gets Eastern Franconia-Bavaria and the Eastern lands, which roughly aligns with the old territory of Austrasia.
The future Germany.
The kernel of it, yes. And then you have the third piece, the Middle Kingdom, which is the most problematic of all.
This goes to Lothair.
It does, and it's this geographically bizarre strip of land. It adds the territory between the Rhine and Rhone rivers to his Italian holdings. Burgundy gets awkwardly split, with Lothair getting the bigger piece and Charles getting what was called the dog's portion.
Let's talk about that Middle Kingdom because it seems inherently unstable.
It was completely unstable. It had no geographic, linguistic, or cultural cohesion. Western Francia was becoming Proto-French. Eastern Francia was Germanic. Luther's kingdom was just everything in between.
With long, vulnerable borders.
And no natural defensive core. It was guaranteed to be fought over and eventually swallowed up by its stronger neighbors for centuries.
So the big consequence of Verdun is that the imperial title is now just an idea. Lothair is emperor, but he has no more real power than his brothers.
The central authority Louis the Pious dreamed of is dead, and Eastern and Western Francia start to go their separate ways. They will never be reunited.
And for Charles the Bald, in his new Western kingdom, the threat is now immediate.
He's created the perfect vulnerability to face the worst external threat of the 9th century.
The Viking tide. And you're saying the research connects their sudden eruption to an environmental factor?
Yes, the medieval warm period, sometimes called the climactic anomaly. It starts around 800.
And we're not talking about a massive temperature spike.
No, just a few degrees. But it was enough to melt ice from northern sea routes that used to be impassable for much of the year.
Which changes everything for maritime culture.
It changes everything. Sailing the North Sea, which was always a risky seasonal thing, suddenly becomes possible year-round by the mid-9th century.
And this unleashes a whole population of young men from Scandinavia.
Exactly. Restless men from lands that were often resource poor, facing their own internal pressures. And now they have year-round access to the wealthy, fractured, and very soft underbelly of the Frankish world.
Though the Franks weren't their only target, at least not at first.
No, they tested other kingdoms first. They raided to the southwest, in Hispania. A great example is their raid on Pamplona.
They didn't just sack it, did they?
No, it was a very strategic strike.
Yeah.
They kidnapped King Inigo Thris' son and demanded a huge ransom. It shows they understood political leverage, not just plunder.
And then in 844, the year right after Verdun, they go after Cordoba.
They do. And the emir, Abdurrahman II, he drives them away. Vikings weren't really interested in long, drawn-out wars, but his reaction is what's so important.
How so?
He recognizes the long-term threat. Unlike Charles the Bald, who will soon start paying them to leave, the Emir of Cordoba immediately starts building a dedicated naval fleet. He understands you have to meet a naval threat with a naval response.
The Franks, meanwhile, are just less capable of coping.
Tragically so. The consequences for Charles the Bald's new kingdom are immediate and, frankly, humiliating. In 845, Viking ships sail right up the Seine, almost to Paris, arriving on Easter Day for maximum psychological shock.
And Charles's response sets a terrible precedent.
He pays them off. He gives the leader, Ragnar Lodbrok, 7,000 pounds of gold, the Danegeld.
It buys him some time, but it sends a clear message.
It sends the message that Francia is incredibly wealthy and militarily weak. It guarantees they will be back for more.
And the raids just intensify after that.
They do, and they expand. Between 858 and 860, they're all over the coasts of Hispania. Some ships even sail into the Mediterranean, hitting Italy. There are even reports of attempted raids on Alexandria in Egypt. The reach is just astounding.
There were some successes against them.
There were. In 859, they tried to take Pamplona again, but were turned back by Garcia, the very same man who'd been kidnapped as a boy and Ordonavars of Asturias. It shows that where you had strong, centralized leadership, you could fight back.
But Charles the Bald was not successful.
Repeatedly not. He has to ransom his own chaplain at one point. He has to watch as Vikings burn the great church at Poitiers. And every time he pays them off, it drains the treasury, requires higher taxes, and makes him deeply unpopular.
There's a quote from a cleric, Piscasius Radbertus, that captures the mood.
It really does. He writes about the profound sense of national shame. Who would have thought, he asks, that such a glorious kingdom, so strong, so vast, would be humiliated and smeared with the filth of such people? It was a crisis of confidence in the entire Carolingian system.
This finally pushes Charles to take some defensive action, around 860.
Yes, he begins this long, slow project of building fortified bridges on the major rivers like the Seine to block the Viking longboats.
But these projects take time.
Years to complete, and in the meantime, people are panicking. It gets so bad that Charles has to issue an edict forbidding the building of unauthorized strongholds.
Which tells you that local lords are taking defense into their own hands.
Exactly. It's a huge sign of the breakdown of central authority. The king can't protect them, so they'll protect themselves. And all the while, the farms near the rivers are completely vulnerable to these raids that, as one chronicler said, broke out of the morning mist without warning.
So in the West, political fragmentation makes the empire unable to cope. But this same wave of energy is also moving east.
Right, and it's having a very different effect, one that will eventually ripple all the way to Constantinople. But the story in the East begins much earlier with trade.
The Scandinavians were already there.
For 300 years before this, they'd had small trading settlements all across the Baltic, and they were pushing further and further inland using the huge river systems.
And this trade network really takes off during the time of the Caliph al-Rashid.
It does. Northern fur sable, ermine are flowing east, and massive amounts of Arab silver, dirhams, are flowing west. They were trading with Khazar and Muslim merchants all the way down to the Caspian Sea. The economic links were already there.
And the local tribes, the Finno-Ugrian peoples, they had a name for these Scandinavian travelers.
They did. They called them the Rus, or the Rus. The word might have just meant red, maybe referring to their hair or ruddy complexion.
And some of these Scandinavian traders start to adopt the name.
They do, and they begin to form a distinct people, the Rus. We have solid evidence for this from a Frankish chronicle in 839. It mentions Byzantine ambassadors arriving at Louis the Pious's court,
Accompanied by some other men.
accompanied by men who said their people were called Rus and had been sent by their king, whose name was the Khagan.
A Khagan, that's a title from the steppes.
It is. It suggests they were already interacting with and borrowing from other established cultures. Louis the Pious thought they were spies because they looked like Swedes, but the research suggests they were already a settled people, intermarried with the locals, with estates centered around a place called Gorodishi on Lake Ilmen.
So around 860, this new, aggressive wave of Vikings arrives in the land of the Rus. They find their distant cousins.
And this is a critical moment. The Khagan of the Rus is facing a serious threat from these newcomers, but his response is completely different from the Franks.
He doesn't fight them.
No, he understands them, so instead of a costly war, he uses diplomacy and strategy. He deflects them.
He points them somewhere else.
He points them downriver towards Constantinople, the richest city in the world. He basically says the targets are much better down there, and he probably sent some of his own men along as guides just to make sure they went.
And this leads to the infamous attack on Constantinople around 860.
It does. The city was ruled by the young Michael III, with his mother and uncles as regents, and like Charles the Bald, they were caught completely off guard.
200 ships appear in the Black Sea.
Filled with thousands of these Rus and Viking raiders, they plunder everything outside the massive city walls and famously just stand there shaking their swords at the terrified people inside.
The patriarch, Photius, described it as like a thunderbolt from heaven.
He did. He detailed the sheer brutality, saying they spared nothing, not respecting female weakness, not pitying tender infants. It was just a week of unrestrained violence.
And then they just leave.
They do. The regents claim it was fear of Byzantine power, but it's more likely that this was just their pattern. Quick raid, maximum profit, then retreat.
But what happens back in the land of the Rus after this is very revealing.
Very. The archaeological evidence suggests that conflict broke out between the Rus hosts and their Viking guests shortly after the raid. There are burn layers at Gordish and the nearby village of Staraya Ladoga that date to this time.
In later Russian tradition, in the primary chronicle, tells the story of Rurik.
The legendary Viking warrior Rurik, who settles there in 862 and builds a kingdom at Novgorod, fighting other Vikings for control. While it's part legend, it strongly points to a real internal power struggle.
But the original settled Rus seem to have won out.
They did, but their numbers suddenly swell, which suggests that their success wasn't just military, it was adaptive. They absorbed many of the newcomers, integrating their military strength and energy into their own state.
And you can see this in the archaeology.
You can. The wooden buildings at Gorodish are repaired, but Staraya Ladoga is rebuilt in stone.
A major upgrade.
It signals a new focus on permanence and defense. They took the Viking shockwave and used it to harden their own state structures.
The contrast with the Franks is just incredible.
It's striking. Western Francia dissolves under the pressure. The Rus state gets attacked, partially destroyed, but it adapts, it absorbs the wave, and it ultimately becomes stronger. Their flexibility laid the groundwork for a future kingdom, while the rigid, tradition-bound Frankish Empire just shattered.
So the failure of Charlemagne's dream really comes down to this internal contradiction. They saw their state as unified, but their traditions demanded it be divided.
A self-defeating spiral. The Rus faced the same threat but found resilience through absorption, through pragmatism. It leaves you wondering if a centralized kingdom is actually more vulnerable when its own traditions are designed to tear it apart.
And the evidence from Fontenoy and the raids on Paris seems to suggest the answer is yes.
The Carolingian Empire failed because it couldn't reconcile its Roman ambition with its Frankish reality, and the borders drawn at Verdun, based on family grudges, became the battle lines for Europe for the next 1,000 years.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available right now. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.